Hello, my name is Bowen Clark. I am now 37 years old, but the story I'm about to tell took place a few years ago, when my life was still a vibrant canvas painted with the glow of success. It was a time when I thought I had everything within my grasp: a thriving career, a happy family, and the admiring glances of those around me. But life, as I gradually came to realize, is never a straight path. It's a rugged road where dazzling peaks can lead you straight into a bottomless abyss. Allow me to take you back to those glorious days before the storm arrived and swept everything away. I stood in front of the mirror, adjusting my tie, admiring the perfectly tailored suit that hugged my frame. That day was significant. I was about to deliver a speech at an international environmental conference in Los Angeles, where the world's brightest minds gathered to discuss the future of our planet. My company, Green Wave Solutions, had been hailed by the press as a pioneer in waste management and environmental protection. We didn't just collect trash. We transformed it into energy, recycled it into new products, and inspired a generation of green businesses. I, Bowen Clark, was the mastermind behind it all. From a vague idea in college, I had built an empire, and at 33, I was at the pinnacle of success. I remember the look in Genesis's eyes, my wife, as she walked into the room holding a cup of morning coffee. "You look sharp," she said with a smile, her brown eyes sparkling under the early sunlight streaming through the window of our penthouse. Genesis was a resident doctor at Cedars-Sinai, one of the city's most prestigious medical facilities. She was not only beautiful but also razor-sharp, with a way of speaking that was both gentle and profoundly persuasive. I often joked that she could silence an entire boardroom with a single glance. Our family lived in a penthouse perched atop a gleaming glass tower in downtown Los Angeles, with sweeping views of the Pacific Ocean. Every morning I stood by the window watching the sun rise over the horizon, feeling as though the world was at my feet. The apartment's interior was a perfect blend of modern and cozy: Italian leather sofas, a walnut dining table, and abstract paintings adorning the walls, all carefully chosen by Genesis with her refined aesthetic taste. This wasn't just a home. It was a symbol of everything we had achieved. I stepped into the living room where the laughter of our two children filled the air. Nolan, my 8-year-old son, was running circles with a remote-controlled airplane, making enthusiastic vroom sounds. Sadie, my 6-year-old daughter, sat on the rug, coloring a picture of the ocean with intense focus. Looking at my children, my heart felt like it might melt. They were everything to me. Nolan, with his messy blonde hair and bright eyes, was always curious, asking me how we turned waste into energy. Sadie, with a smile identical to her mother's, loved telling me about the whales she learned about at school. Both attended a prestigious private school where they took art classes, played soccer, and even went horseback riding on weekends. Genesis approached, placing a hand on my shoulder. "Go on, don't keep the world waiting," she said, her tone teasing. I kissed her forehead, then bent down to hug the kids before leaving. As the elevator doors closed, I felt a wave of contentment wash over me. At that moment, my life seemed perfect. My dark green Porsche 911 glided smoothly along Sunset Boulevard. That day, I wasn't just a businessman. I was an inspiration. The environmental conference at the Los Angeles Convention Center was a major event, bringing together scientists, politicians, and entrepreneurs from around the globe. I had prepared my speech for weeks, and as I stepped onto the stage with the spotlight shining on me, I felt as though I was born to be there. After the conference, I returned to Green Wave Solutions' office, where my team was waiting with a bottle of champagne to celebrate. Our office was located in a sleek, modern building in the financial district, with floor-to-ceiling glass walls and the company logo gleaming on the entrance. As I walked in, I could feel the excitement in the air. "We're making history," I said to the team, raising a glass. They laughed, clapped, and I knew I wasn't just their boss. I was their leader, inspiring them to believe that our work mattered. Those days passed like a sweet dream. But life, as I said, is never a straight line. Beneath that radiant glow, I had no idea that a storm was quietly brewing. ready to sweep everything away. Those glorious days, the smiles, the admiring looks, they were merely the prelude to a dark chapter I was utterly unprepared for. It all started on an early winter morning as I sat in my office gazing out at the gray, overcast Los Angeles sky. The phone rang and Michael, Greenwave's CFO, spoke with a strained voice on the other end. "Bowen, we've got a big problem." Bank interest rates had surged, the tax incentives we'd relied on for years were suddenly cut, and major investors were pulling out, citing the global economic crisis. As I listened, it felt like someone was squeezing my throat. The weeks that followed were a relentless nightmare. Bank loans came due, but Greenwave's cash flow dwindled faster than I could have imagined. I scrambled, reaching out to new investors, calling people who once clapped me on the back at galas, who hailed me as an environmental hero. But now they avoided me. Calls went unanswered, emails met with silence. I began to realize that the halo of glory I'd once basked in was nothing more than a fleeting light, easily snuffed out by the cold winds of reality. In the end, I had no choice. One morning I sat across from the company's lawyer, a middle-aged man with gold-rimmed glasses and a mechanical, monotone voice. He pushed a thick stack of documents toward me, his tone dry. "Bowen, given the current situation, filing for bankruptcy is the only way forward." I stared at the papers, the words dancing before my eyes like a death sentence. Bankruptcy. The word echoed in my mind, heavy as a bronze bell. I had built Greenwave from nothing, pouring sweat and soul into every contract, every project. Now I had to sign its demise. I picked up the pen, my hand trembling. "Is there any other way?" I asked, my voice hoarse. The lawyer shook his head, his eyes devoid of emotion. I signed, each stroke of the pen like a cut to my pride. As I left the office, it started to rain, cold droplets seeping through my coat, as if to remind me that everything was truly over. That night I sat alone, staring at the Greenwave logo on the wall. That sign had once been my pride. Now it felt like a mocking reminder of what was slipping away. Employees began to leave. The office, once alive with laughter, grew hollow, filled only with the clatter of the photocopier and the lonely echo of my footsteps. One afternoon I watched as a bank team arrived to seize equipment and take down the company sign. I wanted to scream, to rush forward and rip the sign back, to punch the wall and unleash my rage and helplessness, but I couldn't. I just stood there, hands shoved deep in my pockets, lips pressed tight to hold back the tears. A young bank employee with neatly combed hair looked at me with pity. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Clark," he said. I didn't respond. I couldn't. I turned away, staring out the window where the rain fell relentlessly, as if weeping for my shattered dream. Filing for bankruptcy wasn't just the death of Greenwave. It marked the beginning of the collapse of my personal life. The bank foreclosed on our penthouse, the sanctuary that had been our family's home. We moved to a small rented house in a bleak suburban neighborhood with pothole-ridden streets and rusted fences. The house had only 2 bedrooms, its walls stained with yellow patches and a faint, musty smell that made me want to cough every time I walked in. Genesis tried to make it bearable. She hung floral curtains, placed potted plants on the windowsills, but I could see the heaviness in her eyes when she thought I wasn't looking. I sold my Porsche, Genesis's SUV, the jewelry, and the expensive furniture. Each item that left my hands felt like a shard of my dignity breaking away. I, who once drove a sports car and dined at Michelin-starred restaurants, now drove a clunky old car with an engine that roared embarrassingly every time it started. A constant reminder of my failure, Nolan and Sadie had to leave their prestigious private school for a public one. I'll never forget the first day I took Nolan to his new school. He clung to my hand, eyes fixed on the ground as if trying to avoid the stares of unfamiliar kids. "I don't want to go here, Dad," he whispered, his voice trembling. I knelt down, looked into his eyes, and tried to keep my voice steady. "It's only temporary, son. I promise I'll get you back to your old school." But as I said those words, I knew I was lying. Genesis, my steadfast wife, began to change. At first, she comforted me, insisting we'd get through this together. But the pressure started to creep in, cracking our marriage. She still worked at the hospital, but she took on extra shifts to cover our living expenses. She came home exhausted, dark circles under her eyes, and I realized she was carrying the burden that should have been mine. Her friends, doctors, lawyers, people still living in big houses and driving luxury cars, began to look at her with pity. I wanted to hold her, to tell her I'd fix everything, but I couldn't. The words stuck in my throat because I knew I had nothing left to promise. I had lost everything: my company, my reputation, and now my confidence. My in-laws started to interfere. My father-in-law, Richard, a stern man with silver hair and a perpetually judgmental gaze, called me a burden. At a family dinner, he stared at me across the table, his voice icy. "You used to be our pride, Bowen, and now a leech living off my daughter." I sat there, gripping my fork, feeling my blood boil. I wanted to argue, to shout that I wasn't a failure, that I'd rise again. But I couldn't. Deep down, I feared he was right. My brother-in-law, Joseph, was even worse. A prominent lawyer, he reveled in his successful career and lavish lifestyle. At a dinner at my in-laws' house, as I tried to tell Nolan and Sadie a funny story to lighten the mood, Joseph cut in. "You used to be such a big shot, Bowen. And now, sitting here telling kids stories while my sister breaks her back working." He smirked, swirling his glass of wine. Genesis stood nearby, silent, not saying a word in my defense, though I knew she'd heard every biting word. I hid my pain in front of the kids, but inside I was breaking. That night I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, questioning where I'd gone wrong. Was I too confident? Had I failed to prepare for the risks? Or was I simply not as good as I thought? Those questions gnawed at me, making me feel like I was no longer the Bowen Clark of old. I was just a shadow, a failure, a husband and father who couldn't protect his family. The next day, I decided to visit my parents, taking a crowded bus to my hometown. It had been years since I'd returned to the place where I grew up, running barefoot through fields, dreaming of a grand future. Now I was coming back, not as the hero I once imagined, but as a failure, carrying a heavy burden of shame that pressed on my chest like a boulder. I was no longer the Bowen Clark featured in Forbes, the man who drove a Porsche and lived in a penthouse. I was just a husband, a father, searching for a sliver of peace amidst the storm that had swept everything away. The bus stopped at a small station, where the scent of dry grass and dusty earth mingled in the air. I grabbed my old suitcase and stepped off. My hometown, a small village on the outskirts of California, was almost unchanged. Red-tiled houses, old Tom's grocery store with its faded sign, and the ancient oak tree at the crossroads. It was all like a painting from my memories, both familiar and distant. I walked down the main road, feeling the curious glances of a few locals. They didn't recognize me, or perhaps they chose not to. I had once been the pride of this town, the boy who left to make it big in Los Angeles. Now I was back, unannounced, like a fugitive. My parents' house sat at the end of the road, a single-story wooden home with a small porch where my mother used to knit in the afternoons. When I knocked, she opened the door, her eyes lighting up for a moment before clouding with worry. "Bowen!" she exclaimed, pulling me into a tight hug. The smell of freshly baked cookies wafted from the kitchen, stirring memories of childhood when life was simple and safe. My father appeared from the living room, his hair grayer than I remembered, but his smile as warm as ever. "Son, why didn't you tell us you were coming?" he asked, clapping my shoulder. I forced a smile, trying to hide the heaviness in my heart. "I just wanted to see you both." They led me inside, setting a steaming cup of coffee and a plate of cookies in front of me. The small kitchen, with its scratched wooden table, worn upholstered chairs, and a family photo on the wall, felt both comforting and painful. I had once sent money home to my parents, helping them fix the roof, buy a new TV, even pay off their mortgage. But now I sat there with nothing but empty hands and a heart full of scars. My parents immediately sensed I was hiding something. When my mother asked about Genesis and the kids, I gave vague answers. Everything's fine, just some work challenges. I talked about Nolan and Sadie, how they were doing well in school, how Genesis was busy at the hospital. But I avoided mentioning the cramped rental house, the noisy old car, or Greenwave's bankruptcy. I didn't want them to worry, didn't want them to see me as a failure. But my mother's eyes, the way she squeezed my hand tighter than usual, told me she knew I was lying. "You're tired, aren't you?" she asked, her voice gentle but laced with sorrow. I wanted to deny it, to say I was fine, that I was still the Bowen Clark they were proud of. But I only nodded, staring into my coffee, trying to hide my reddening eyes. My father, a man of few words, stood and patted my shoulder. "Whatever's going on, you're still our son," he said, his voice low but firm. Those simple words pierced my heart like a knife. I didn't deserve their unconditional love, not when I had let everything crumble. That night, I lay on my old childhood bed, staring at the cracked ceiling I used to count to lull myself to sleep. The crickets chirped outside, the wind whistled through the window, pulling me back to a carefree time. For the first time in weeks, after countless sleepless nights, I slept soundly. The next morning, my mother dragged me to the backyard, where she tended a bed of daisies and a few tomato plants. "Help me water the plants," she said, handing me an old watering can. I followed her lead, feeling the damp earth under my feet, the scent of fresh grass in the air. In that moment, I felt peace, as if the outside world, with its debts, taunts, and pitying looks, didn't exist. But I knew that peace was fleeting. That afternoon, my father called me into the living room. He sat in his old armchair, holding a small tin box I recognized immediately, the one he used to store their savings. "We don't have much," he said, opening it to reveal a carefully wrapped stack of cash. "This is what we've saved. Take it to get by." I stared at the money, my heart stopping. I knew it was the money I'd sent them years ago, back when I was successful Bowen Clark, when I thought I could provide for the world. Now it sat before me, a reminder of how far I'd fallen. "I can't take it," I said, pushing the box back. My voice trembled, not with anger, but with shame. I, who had once been the family's provider, who bought them a new TV and paid off their debts, was now being offered my own money back. It wasn't just money. It was a symbol of my failure, of my inability to care for those I loved. But my parents wouldn't let me refuse. My mother took my hand, her eyes resolute. "This isn't for you," she said. "It's for Nolan and Sadie. Those kids need a strong father, and you need time to get back on your feet. Take it for them." Her words hit me like a punch to the chest. I wanted to refuse, to shout that I didn't need pity, that I'd rise again on my own. But looking into her eyes, I saw no pity, only love and belief in me. I bowed my head, took the box, feeling as though I'd swallowed a bitter pill. On the day I left, I stood on the porch, watching my parents wave from a distance. My mother hugged me tightly, whispering, "You're our pride, no matter what." My father only nodded, but his eyes said everything. I boarded the bus, carrying the tin box and a heavy heart. As the bus pulled away, I looked out the window, watching their house fade into the distance. I didn't know then that this painful, humbling return would mark the beginning of a new journey, one I never could have anticipated. On the way back to Los Angeles, a thought flickered in my mind about the life insurance policy. I had purchased a substantial policy back when Greenwave was at its peak, when I thought I needed to prepare for every scenario. If I ended my life now, the payout from that policy could let Genesis live comfortably, allow Nolan and Sadie to return to their old school, and give them the life they deserved. The thought was horrific, but in my desperation, it felt like the only way out. The bus stopped at a small station a few miles from my parents' house. I stepped off, the cold wind carrying the scent of dry grass and dusty earth, but I felt nothing except emptiness. I didn't know how I would end my life. Just then, as I took a few steps from the station, a sudden sound shattered the silence. The low growl of an engine, then a sleek black Mercedes pulled up beside me, kicking up a cloud of dust. I stood frozen, unsure of what was happening. The car door opened and a man stepped out, dressed in a perfectly tailored gray suit, his leather shoes gleaming in the sunlight. He smiled, a smile both familiar and strange, making me blink to ensure I wasn't dreaming. "Bowen Clark," he called, his voice warm but brimming with confidence. "Still as brooding as ever, huh?" I stared at him, racking my brain, and then it hit me. Lincoln. Lincoln Hayes, my old friend from leaner days, the one I'd lent money to start his business over a decade ago when we were both young dreamers. We'd lost touch long ago as I got swept up in green wave and he vanished from my radar. But now, here he was, looking like a dazzlingly successful version of himself, while I, a failure, stood on the roadside with a battered suitcase and worn-out shoes. "Lincoln," I whispered, my voice faltering with shock. He strode over, pulling me into a strong hug, clapping my shoulder as if time hadn't passed. "My God, Bowen, it's been years," he laughed, his voice full of excitement. I stood there, rigid, unsure how to respond. Part of me wanted to run, to hide my pathetic state. I didn't want him to see me like this. A bankrupt man, a powerless father, a husband scorned by his in-laws. But Lincoln didn't give me a chance to retreat. He looked at me, his gaze sharp but not judgmental, as if he already knew everything without me saying a word. "Where are you headed, Bowen?" he asked. I didn't answer right away, lowering my head as shame surged like a wave. "Just back to the city," I muttered, my voice hoarse. He nodded, as if sensing I was hiding something. "Get in the car," he said, opening the Mercedes door. "We need to talk." I hesitated, staring at the red dirt road stretching ahead where the bus had just disappeared. The dark thoughts still lingered in my mind, but something in Lincoln's voice, its sincerity, its confidence, made it impossible to turn away. I climbed into the car, enveloped by the scent of new leather and expensive cologne, a bitter reminder of the luxurious life I'd once had. As Lincoln started the engine, I didn't know that this moment, his sudden appearance, would become a pivotal turning point, a faint glimmer of hope piercing the thick darkness of my life. I wasn't ready to believe in it yet, but it was there, fragile but undeniable, like a small flame flickering in a storm. Lincoln's Mercedes glided smoothly along the red dirt road, leaving behind the small bus stop where I'd just stepped off, carrying with me a fragile spark of hope. I sat on the soft leather seat, my tattered suitcase resting on my lap, the tin box of my parents' savings tucked inside. Lincoln drove, his eyes focused ahead, but a gentle smile played on his lips as if trying to put me at ease. I wanted to say something, to ask why he'd appeared at this exact moment, but my throat felt constricted. The dark thoughts from the bus ride, about Genesis, Nolan, Sadie, and the life insurance policy, still lingered, and I didn't know how to open up to someone who had stepped out of my past, looking like the embodiment of everything I'd lost. Lincoln broke the silence first. "You look like you've been through a storm, Bowen," he said, his voice low but non-judgmental. "What's going on?" I glanced at him, his gaze sincere, devoid of pity, yet I felt an invisible wall between us. He was Lincoln Hayes, a shining success, while I was merely a shadow of the old Bowen Clark. I lowered my head, mumbling, "Just some rough times. I'll be fine." But my voice faltered, and I knew Lincoln wasn't buying it. We pulled into a small coffee shop in a nearby town, a humble place with weathered wooden walls and the aroma of roasted coffee in the air. I carried my suitcase, following Lincoln inside, feeling like a stranger in my own story. He ordered 2 black coffees, slid one toward me, and sat down, his gaze sharp but patient. "All right, tell me," he said, his voice warm. "Everything." I took a deep breath, watching the steam rise from the coffee. I didn't want to expose my failures, didn't want Lincoln, who once saw me as a hero, to see how pathetic I'd become. But something in his patience, the way he sat there waiting without judgment, made it impossible to stay silent. I started talking, my voice hoarse, as if each word were a shard of my pride. I told him about the economic crisis, the soaring interest rates, the partners who turned their backs when I needed them most. I described the day I signed the bankruptcy papers, each stroke of the pen like a knife to my heart. I spoke of the foreclosed penthouse, the noisy old car, and how Nolan and Sadie had to leave their private school. And finally, I shared about my in-laws, my father-in-law calling me a burden, my brother-in-law's mocking sneer as he labeled me a leech. I didn't mention the dark thoughts from the bus, but Lincoln's eyes seemed to sense how close I'd come to the edge. He listened without interrupting, nodding occasionally as if cataloging every detail. When I stopped, my throat dry, Lincoln leaned forward, placing his hands on the table, looking me straight in the eye. "You know, Bowen," he said, his voice steady as stone, "if you hadn't lent me that money back then, I wouldn't be where I am today. No Apex Innovations, no mansion, nothing. You weren't just a friend. You changed my life." I shook my head, letting out a bitter laugh. "That's the past, Lincoln. Now I've got nothing. No money, no reputation, not even confidence." But he didn't let me wallow in self-pity. He gripped my shoulder, his eyes blazing. "You're still Bowen Clark," he said. "The man who built Greenwave from nothing. The man who inspired an entire industry. You think this failure defines you? It's just a chapter, not the whole book." Lincoln didn't give me time to sink into doubt. He started talking about Apex Innovations, his tech company developing renewable energy solutions, a field not far from my experience at Greenwave. "I need someone like you," he said, his voice brimming with excitement. "No one else, just you. I want you as a partner, Bowen. I'll put you in a leadership role and we'll do big things together." I stared at him, unable to believe my ears. "Lincoln, I just went bankrupt. I've got nothing to bring to the table. You don't need a failure like me." But he just laughed, that confident grin I remembered from our college days in dive bars, dreaming of the future. "You're not a failure," he said. "You're someone with grit, experience, and most importantly, integrity. Money can buy talent, but it can't buy honesty. I trust you, Bowen, and I know you'll prove me right." He pulled a business card from his wallet and slid it toward me. "Here," he said, "when you're ready, call me. But first, I'll take care of your most pressing debt to get the legal pressure off your back. Then we start." I took the card, staring at the gold-embossed words, Lincoln Hayes, CEO, Apex Innovations. I wanted to refuse, to say I didn't deserve it, that I'd only let him down. But a small part of me, the remnant of the old Bowen Clark, felt a spark ignite. Not grand hope, but a chance, a way out of the darkness. I returned to the rental house in the Los Angeles suburbs that evening, carrying Lincoln's card and a mix of emotions. Genesis was in the kitchen, her eyes weary after a long hospital shift. Nolan and Sadie were asleep, the house quiet except for the ticking of the wall clock. I told her about Lincoln, the unexpected meeting, his offer. She listened, but her eyes wavered as if she didn't dare believe. "Are you sure, Bowen?" she asked softly. "You've been through so much. What if this doesn't work out?" Her words cut like a knife, but I didn't blame her. She'd seen me collapse, had carried the family's burden when I couldn't. "I don't know," I replied, taking her hand. "But I have to try. For you, for the kids, for myself." She nodded, but I saw the doubt in her eyes. She didn't say it, but I knew she was afraid. Afraid I'd fail again, afraid our family couldn't take another blow. In the days that followed, Lincoln took action. One morning, a middle-aged woman with sharp eyes and a confident voice knocked on our door. She introduced herself as Lincoln's lawyer. "Mr. Hayes has settled your most urgent bank debt," she said, handing me a stack of documents for confirmation. "You're free from legal pressure now. You can focus on work." I stared at the numbers on the papers, feeling a weight lift from my chest. But alongside the relief came a new wave of shame. I, Bowen Clark, who once paid for others, now needed a friend's help to escape debt. Lincoln didn't let me dwell in self-doubt. He called daily, his voice full of energy, talking about Apex Innovations' new project. "We're building a cutting-edge renewable energy system," he said. "You've got the experience from Greenwave, Bowen. You know how to lead teams, how to handle crises. I need you as project manager." I listened, still flooded with doubt. I'd failed once. What guaranteed I wouldn't fail again? But Lincoln gave me no time to linger in those thoughts. He sent plane tickets asking me to come to San Francisco to meet his team. "You don't have to commit right away," he texted. "Just come. See how we work and feel it for yourself." I stood in front of the mirror in our rental house, adjusting an old tie, the one I wore during Greenwave's glory days. The suit was slightly tight, but I had no other choice. Genesis stood behind me, watching through the mirror, her eyes a mix of worry and hope. "You look good," she said, forcing a smile. I took her hand, feeling the slight tremble in her palm. "I'll try," I said. "I can't promise success, but I promise I won't give up." As the plane took off, I looked down at Los Angeles, shrinking below, feeling like I was leaving behind a part of myself, the part crushed by failure. But when the plane landed in San Francisco, a small shift stirred within me. Lincoln was waiting at the airport, that same confident smile on his face. "Welcome to the next chapter, Bowen," he said, clapping my shoulder. I didn't know if I was ready, but as I followed him, I felt a faint spark. Not grand hope, but a chance, a way out of the darkness. And for the first time in months, I thought that maybe, just maybe, I still had a shot at rising again. Lincoln took me to Apex Innovations headquarters, a sleek glass building in the heart of Silicon Valley. The structure towered into the sky, shimmering under the sunlight, with the Apex logo elegantly etched on the main entrance. Standing before it, I felt like I'd stepped into a different world, one I used to belong to but now felt foreign. Lincoln led me through the lobby where young employees moved briskly, clutching laptops and phones, their voices buzzing with energy. "This is where we make magic happen," Lincoln said, his tone brimming with pride. "And you're going to be part of it." He handed me over to Delilah, the HR director, a middle-aged woman with sharp eyes and a professional smile. "Welcome to Apex, Mr. Clark," she said, handing me a crisp new employee badge. I stared at the words, "Bowen Clark Project Manager," printed on it, feeling as though I was holding a relic from another life. Lincoln explained that I'd be leading a new project, a renewable energy system using cutting-edge technology to optimize solar panel efficiency. "You've got the experience from Greenwave," he said. "You know how to manage teams, handle crises, and turn ideas into reality. I know you can do this." But as Delilah guided me through the office, introducing me to the team, an invisible weight pressed down on me. Apex's office wasn't like Greenwave in its heyday. No media spotlight, no champagne-fueled galas, no conference speeches. Instead, it was filled with cluttered desks, endless meetings, and people working tirelessly. I realized this was real gritty work, the kind I'd done when I first started out but had forgotten during the years of being celebrated by the press. I began my role as project manager, overseeing a team of 10 engineers and specialists, ensuring the solar panel project stayed on track. At first, I felt out of place. The engineers, a decade younger than me, used tech jargon I had to look up at night. They eyed me with curiosity, some likely aware of Greenwave's story, of the pioneering entrepreneur now standing before them in a slightly tight suit. I sensed their scrutiny, and each time my self-doubt whispered that I didn't belong here, but I refused to back down. I started with the basics, reviewing project documents, organizing team meetings, listening to each engineer's input. I realized that my experience from Greenwave, despite its failure, was a treasure trove. I knew how to lead teams, resolve conflicts, and turn scattered ideas into concrete plans. I worked day and night, not to prove myself to others, but to prove to myself that I still had it. A week later, the project hit its first crisis. A major solar panel supplier abruptly canceled our contract, threatening to delay us by months. The team panicked. Young engineers argued heatedly in the meeting room, and I felt their eyes on me as if testing, "What are you going to do, Bowen Clark?" I took a deep breath, recalling the days at Greenwave when I faced similar crises. I called an emergency meeting, broke the problem into parts, and contacted alternative suppliers. After 3 relentless days, I secured a new supplier, negotiated a better deal, and got the project back on track. When I presented the solution at the next meeting, the room fell silent. Then a young engineer, Mia, with her hair tied high, spoke up. "How did you pull that off? I thought we were done for." I gave a small smile, feeling a flicker of confidence return. "I've been through worse," I replied, "and I learned there's always a way out if you don't give up." Those words, though simple, were a reminder to myself. I wasn't the helpless failure anymore. I still had grit, still had ability. Gradually, the team began to respect me. They stopped seeing me as an outsider and started viewing me as a leader. Mia began seeking my advice on technical issues. Another engineer, Kevin, brought me coffee during early mornings, calling me boss with a genuine smile. They started calling me the soul of the project, a nickname that made me both proud and uneasy. I didn't want to be put on a pedestal again, didn't want to fall into the trap of chasing glory. But I couldn't deny that being respected, being needed, was slowly healing the scars in my heart. Word of my new job reached my in-laws. One evening, Genesis's mother called, her tone skeptical. "I hear you're working with some rich friend?" "Leaning on someone else again, Bowen?" I gripped the phone, forcing myself to stay calm. "No, ma'am," I replied firmly. "I'm working hard on my own and I'll prove it." But deep down, I knew they didn't believe me. To them, I was still the failure, the leech they'd mocked. I didn't blame them. I'd given them reason to think that way. But I swore to myself I'd change their perception. Lincoln was the only one who never doubted me. He visited the office weekly, checking on the project's progress and always making time to talk. "You're doing great, Bowen," he said, clapping my shoulder. "I knew you could." His words weren't just encouragement. They were a reminder that I still had worth, that my failure didn't define me. The solar panel project began showing results. We completed the first testing phase ahead of schedule, saving Apex significant costs. In a meeting with partners, I presented the results, my voice stronger than I'd thought possible. When I finished, the room erupted in applause, and Lincoln looked at me with pride. "That's the Bowen Clark I know," he whispered as we left the meeting room. News of my new role at Apex Innovations began to spread, slowly but inexorably, like ripples across a lake. A few articles on tech news sites mentioned the return of Bowen Clark alongside Lincoln Hayes, the founder of Apex. An old Greenwave partner sent a congratulatory email, its tone a mix of surprise and caution. "I knew you wouldn't stay down, Clark." Reading those words felt like a cool breeze, but I couldn't ignore the growing unease in my chest. I wasn't afraid of the spotlight or tough questions from investors. What I feared was facing those who had turned their backs on me, who had looked at me with pity or contempt, especially my wife's family. Genesis called me one evening before the conference, her voice soft but laced with worry. "My mom called," she said, hesitating. "She heard you're speaking at a big event. She doesn't think you can pull it off." I gripped the phone, a cold stone dropping in my stomach. Genesis's mother, Eleanor, had never hidden her disappointment in me since Greenwave's bankruptcy. Her father, Richard, was worse, his mocking words sharp as knives. And her brother, Joseph, was always ready to jab at me with his smug smirk and condescending tone. "They think you're riding Lincoln's coattails," Genesis continued, her voice fading. I didn't know what to say to them, Bowen. I took a deep breath, trying to keep my voice steady. "They're entitled to their doubts. But I'll prove them wrong," I said, hearing her sigh on the other end, a sound both weary and hopeful. "I believe in you," she said, but I sensed the waver in her voice. Genesis was caught in the middle, between her family who looked down on me and me, the husband trying to rise from the ashes. I didn't blame her, but her silence over the past months, when her parents and brother mocked me, left a lingering ache in my heart. The day of the conference arrived, and the atmosphere at the San Francisco Convention Center buzzed like a beehive. Large banners proclaiming the future of renewable energy adorned the venue, and camera flashes from reporters lit up the air. I stood in the prep room adjusting my suit, a new one Lincoln insisted on buying, saying, "You need to look like a leader." He stood beside me reviewing my presentation on a tablet, his eyes brimming with confidence. "You're going to do great, Bowen," he said, clapping my shoulder. "Today isn't just about Apex. It's about you." I nodded, but my heart pounded in my chest. I wasn't afraid of speaking to a crowd. I'd done it dozens of times at Greenwave. But this was different. I knew my wife's family would be there. Genesis had mentioned that her parents and Joseph were invited as VIPs. Thanks to Joseph's connections in the legal industry and Richard's business ties. I didn't know how they'd react to seeing me on stage, but I knew this encounter wouldn't be easy. As I stepped onto the stage, the spotlight blinded me for a moment. The audience was a sea of faces. Investors in expensive suits, engineers with curious eyes, and reporters with phones, laptops, and recorders. I took a deep breath and began, my voice stronger than I expected. "At Apex Innovations, we're not just building technology," I said, my gaze sweeping the room. "We're building a future where clean energy isn't just an option. It's the standard." The crowd nodded, some clapping. A surge of energy rose within me as if the old Bowen Clark was coming back to life. But then I saw them. My wife's family, seated in the third row near the main aisle, Richard with his silver hair and cold stare, arms crossed tightly. Eleanor, in an elegant red dress, watched me with undisguised skepticism. And Joseph, with his familiar smirk, whispered something to his father, making Richard nod, his lips pursed. Genesis sat beside them, her eyes wavering as if torn between supporting me and keeping peace with her family. A wave of anger surged, but I pushed it down, focusing on my presentation. I spoke about the solar panel project, the test results that exceeded expectations, and the potential to transform the energy industry. The crowd applauded, and I saw Lincoln in the wings giving me a thumbs up with a radiant smile. After the presentation, I stepped off the stage, preparing for the networking session. But before I could leave the auditorium, my wife's family approached. Richard led the way, his voice icy. "Quite a show, Bowen," he said loud enough for nearby heads to turn. "You think standing up there with a few slides can erase your bankrupt past? You're riding Lincoln Hayes' coattails, aren't you?" I clenched my fists, feeling blood rush to my head. Joseph chimed in, his smirk sharper. "Nice presentation," he said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "But what's next? Working for your buddy to scrape by?" The crowd around us began to murmur, curious eyes turning toward me. Genesis stood behind them, her face pale, but she said nothing, her eyes pleading with me not to escalate. I opened my mouth to respond, but before I could, Lincoln appeared from the wings, stepping beside me. He stood tall, his gaze sharp as a blade, locking onto Richard and Joseph. "I think you're mistaken," Lincoln said, his voice calm but commanding. "Without Bowen Clark, there would be no Lincoln Hayes today. He gave me a chance when I had nothing, and now he's the soul of this project. Apex's success today is because of Bowen, not me." The auditorium fell silent, as if time had paused. Richard and Joseph froze, their faces stiffening, unable to find words to counter. Eleanor opened her mouth but closed it, her eyes wavering. Genesis looked at me, her eyes glistening as if seeing me for the first time in months, not as a failure but as the man she once loved. The crowd began to clap, not for me or Lincoln but for the truth that had just been spoken. I didn't need to respond to Richard or Joseph. Lincoln had spoken for me, and the truth, my success at Apex, was the strongest answer. After the event, Lincoln pulled me aside, handing me a glass of wine. "See," he said, winking, "you didn't need to argue with them. You've already won." I nodded, but a quiet pain lingered. Not because of my in-laws' taunts, but because of Genesis. She still hadn't spoken, hadn't stood up for me. I knew she was torn, but her silence still hurt. The conference ended with praise from partners and investors. A local reporter wrote about Bowen Clark's remarkable comeback, but I declined interviews. I didn't want the old spotlight back. I just wanted to do my job well for Lincoln, for Apex, and for my family. But I knew this event had changed everything. My wife's family, though reluctant to admit it, was stunned by the reality that I was no longer the Leech they thought. And for the first time in months, I felt like I was truly rising again. After the conference, the solar panel project at Apex Innovations became a focal point of attention. Investors began reaching out, and congratulatory emails and partnership proposals flooded in like a small deluge. An article in a local tech magazine dubbed me the bankrupt entrepreneur rewriting his story. I declined all interview requests, not out of fear of the spotlight, but because I didn't want to be swept up in the whirlwind of fame again. I'd been there before, letting accolades blind me to reality. And I wasn't about to repeat that mistake. Still, I couldn't deny that the praise, the firm handshakes from partners, and the respectful looks from my Apex team were slowly healing the scars in my heart. The project progressed beyond expectations. The second testing phase finished 3 weeks ahead of schedule, with solar panel efficiency surpassing industry standards. In a meeting, I presented the results to Apex's leadership, my voice ringing out strong, free of the tremor of self-doubt. When I finished, the room erupted in applause, and Lincoln, seated at the head of the table, winked at me. "See, Bowen," he said afterward when it was just the two of us in the office. "I told you you'd do it." I gave a small smile, the first genuine one in months. "Thanks, Lincoln," I replied, "but I'm still learning to believe in myself." Partners started seeking me out. An investor from Silicon Valley who had refused to meet me when Greenwave collapsed now emailed to invite me to lunch. "I hear you're making waves at Apex," he wrote. "We should talk." I politely declined, not out of resentment, but because I didn't need validation from those who'd turned their backs. Instead, I focused on the work. Late nights poring over technical documents, meetings with the team to solve problems, moments when I saw our project inch closer to success. Each step forward was a brick, rebuilding the self-respect I'd lost. News of my comeback didn't stay confined to the business world. Old friends who had avoided me when Greenwave went under began reaching out. A college buddy texted, "Bowen, I read about you. Congrats, man." A former Greenwave partner called, his voice tinged with regret. "I was wrong to doubt you, Clark. You're still a star." I responded briefly, politely, but inside I felt no joy. Their congratulations came too late, and I'd learned that my worth wasn't in others' praise but in what I achieved. Genesis, the wife I loved more than anything, was slowly changing. One evening, she flew to San Francisco to visit me, the first time since I started at Apex. When she stepped into my small apartment, I saw her eyes weren't as heavy as before. She hugged me tightly, whispering, "I'm proud of you, Bowen. I'm sorry for doubting you." Her words were like a warm breeze, soothing the wounds I'd carried for months. But I still felt a distance, not because she didn't love me, but because she'd been hurt so much by our collapse, by her family's taunts. "You don't need to apologize, Jen," I said, holding her hand. "But I need you with me, not just today, but going forward." She nodded, her eyes shimmering with tears, and for the first time I felt we were finding our way back to each other. My wife's family, though loath to admit it, had received a bitter lesson. After the conference, news of my role at Apex spread, and their earlier mockery began to backfire. At a family gathering, one of Genesis's aunts, who once called me a leech, now asked her about my work with curiosity. "What's Bowen doing in San Francisco? I hear he's working with a millionaire." Genesis recounted to me, her voice tinged with humor. "They're starting to see you differently, Bowen. But I know they'll never admit they were wrong. I didn't need their admission. The arrogance of Richard, Eleanor, and Joseph had turned against them. Their taunts, which once kept me awake at night, now stood as proof of their pettiness. In the eyes of their relatives and society, they'd lost face, not because I retaliated, but because the truth had been laid bare. They grew quiet, no longer daring to openly insult me. Once, Joseph texted Genesis, reluctantly asking about me. "Tell Bowen I congratulate him." I smiled when she read me the message, but not out of satisfaction. I didn't need Joseph's approval. I just needed to know I'd overcome their scorn. The lesson of karma became clearer than ever. Lincoln was living proof of it. Over a decade ago, I'd lent him money when he was nearly bankrupt, with no ulterior motive. Now he'd returned, not just repaying the favor, but giving me a chance to rise again. The kindness I'd sown hadn't vanished. It came back in the most unexpected way, like a flame lighting my dark path. In contrast, the arrogance and contempt of Genesis's family had brought them their own shame. They'd thought me a failure, but their attitude now made them the ones looked at with disdain by those who once respected them. I didn't feel triumphant. Revenge wasn't my goal. Each day I woke up, worked with my team at Apex, and saw our project nearing success, knowing that was the strongest response. I didn't need to say anything to Richard, Eleanor, or Joseph. My career, my returning reputation, and the trust from Lincoln, my team, and Genesis were all I needed. Standing on the balcony looking out over the city, I felt for the first time in years that I belonged here, not because of the spotlight, but because I'd found myself again. I stood on the balcony of my small San Francisco apartment, the early morning sunlight filtering through the high rises, casting a soft golden glow over the waking city. The breeze carried the salty scent of the bay, mingling with distant car horns and the frenetic pulse of Silicon Valley. Holding a cup of coffee, its warmth seeping into my palms, I felt, for the first time in years, a genuine sense of peace. Not the peace of my glory days atop Greenwave Solutions, but the peace of someone who had walked through darkness, hit rock bottom, and found light on the other side. My journey, from the heights of wealth to bankrupt ruin, from despair to resurgence, was not just my story, but a lesson in karma, kindness, and the power of never giving up. Genesis, the wife I loved more than anything, had changed too. After the conference, she called more often, her voice no longer weighed down by worry or doubt. One evening, she flew to San Francisco, bringing a drawing by Sadie, a picture of me standing in a field of solar panels, beaming with a radiant smile. She said, "This is her dad, saving the earth," Genesis said, her eyes sparkling. I hugged her, feeling her warmth, and for the first time in years, I sensed our home being rebuilt. "I'm sorry, Bowen," she whispered. "I wasn't strong enough to stand by you when things were bad." I shook my head, holding her hand. "You were always there, Jen," I said. "We just needed time to find each other again." I began spending more time with Nolan and Sadie, even if only through video calls. I listened to Nolan talk about his soccer team, how he scored a goal in a school match. I heard Sadie read a poem she wrote, her voice chirping with pride. I sent money home. Not much, but enough to ensure they had books, new clothes, and the weekend outings Genesis had once cut back on. Each time I heard their laughter, my heart felt lighter, as if I were redeeming the months I'd let them down. My parents noticed the change too. During a call, my mother's voice choked with emotion. "You've made us proud, Bowen. No matter what, you're our son." I smiled, thinking of the tin box of savings they'd given me, how they believed in me even when I didn't believe in myself. I sent money to them more regularly now, not just to repay them, but to show that their son had risen again, no longer the defeated man who returned home with slumped shoulders. Work at Apex Innovations continued to thrive. The solar panel project completed its final phase, and we began securing major contracts from international energy companies. Partners didn't just seek out Lincoln. They sought me, wanting my input, eager to work with Bowen Clark, who turned a project into a success from nothing. I no longer shied away from the spotlight, but I didn't let it blind me either. Greenwave taught me that fame is fleeting, that true value lies in the work you do and the people you impact. One afternoon, I received an email from a journalist requesting to write about my journey, from the heights to the depths and back again. I declined, not out of fear, but because I wanted my story told through actions, not words on a page. I wanted Nolan and Sadie to grow up knowing their father overcame failure, not for applause, but to give them a better life. I wanted Genesis to look at me, not with worry, but with the pride she had in our early days of marriage. The greatest lesson I drew from this journey was about karma. Kindness never vanishes. It waits for the right moment to return. Lincoln was proof of that, but not the only proof. The Apex employees who once doubted me but now called me the soul of the project showed that when you work with heart, you earn respect. Conversely, arrogance and contempt, like that shown by Genesis's family, always come with a price. They'd lost face not because I fought back, but because the truth exposed their pettiness. I wanted to send a message to anyone at rock bottom as I once was. Never underestimate yourself and don't let others define your worth. Those who scorn you in your lowest moments may be the first to curry favor when you rise. Live kindly, not because you expect reward, but because the seeds you sow today may be your lifeline tomorrow. I learned this from Lincoln, from my parents, and from my own mistakes. Today I stand here not as the Bowen Clark of Forbes articles, not as an environmental hero or a failure. I'm just Bowen, a father, a husband, a man who walked through darkness and found light. I don't need revenge or resentment. My current success, the project at Apex, the respect from my team, the love of Genesis and our children, is the clearest answer to the injustices I endured. I smiled, looking out over the city, and knew I'd found peace not in the spotlight, but in my own heart. 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 My own heart.